Okay, so like, have you ever felt like uh, instead of, expanding our minds,
Yeah.
education, it's kind of it shrinks us down,
Mm.
to fit into like these pre-made boxes?
Yeah.
We're going to be diving into some pretty thought-provoking stuff today about education.
Mm.
And I'm not talking about your usual like public versus private debate or anything like
All
that.
right.
This is something a little bit different.
Yeah. You're right. It goes way deeper than that.
Yeah.
We're going to be looking at this recent article by Professor Jorge Mahfud,
Oh, yeah.
and it was published in some major Latin American newspapers like Pagina Doce out of Argentina.
Okay. For those who might not know, Professor Mahfud, he wrote that book,
Yes.
The Wild Frontier, 200 Years of Anglo-Saxon Fanaticism in Latin America.
That's right.
And let me tell you, Professor Mahfud does not shy away from bold claims.
Definitely not.
Yeah.
And in this article, he's arguing that the real fight that we should be having about education isn't about like funding models, It's about the very soul of education.
But
He says it's a battle between for-profit versus not for-profit.
interesting.
And he argues that this push toward commercialization is creating he uses the term dehumanized beings.
Wow. Okay, that's a pretty intense statement. When he says dehumanized, what exactly does he mean by that?
Well, he draws a parallel to the education of slaves in the 19th century.
Okay.
And he says the goal back then was to teach just enough, to perform specific tasks,
Uh-huh.
but never enough to question the system.
Keep him working, but not thinking too much.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Mahfud, he uses a personal anecdote to kind of illustrate this point. He talks about his own grandfather, who was a farmer in Uruguay,
Okay.
and he couldn't even read, but he firmly believed that education meant freedom.
I love that.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Huh.
Like, he might not have been a scholar himself or been able to read himself, but just that basic understanding of
Right.
power
Of knowledge.
of knowledge.
Yeah.
And Mahfoud's father kind of continued that legacy.
Okay.
Even as a busy businessman, he would trade his carpentry skills for books. Wait, he traded for books that he didn't even read?
Yes.
That's fascinating.
It was about something bigger than just personal reading.
Yeah.
It was about the potential that each book held.
Yeah.
And this speaks to the way that Uruguay as a country really placed importance on education, going back to reformers like Jose Pedro Varela and Jose Batelli Ordonez, who pushed for free, high-quality education for all.
So if Uruguay had this, like, really great system that valued education and freedom so much, where do things start to kind of go wrong in this picture?
Well, Mahfud argues that dictatorships, especially in Latin America, really saw intellectuals and books as very dangerous things.
Okay.
He even talks about the CIA using the theories of Antonio Gramsci, who was a Marxist thinker,
Right.
to discredit intellectuals.
It's funny how they're using a critique of power structures to maintain a power structure.
Yeah.
What were these theories exactly?
So Gramsci argued that the people in power control society, not just through force, but through ideas and culture.
Okay.
And this is referred to as cultural hegemony.
So they weren't just like censoring information. They were like shaping the way people think.
Exactly.
Oh, wow.
And Mahfud says that this shift from blatant censorship to more subtle manipulation is still happening today.
Okay.
So instead of book burnings, we have the constant message that the humanities are useless.
Right. It's like, go be an engineer, but don't you dare question why you're building what you're building.
Right, and that gets right to Mahfud's point.
Right.
He brings up this argument we hear a lot from people like Andres Oppenheimer,
Yeah.
who says, we need more engineers and fewer philosophers.
I've heard that one a lot.
Yeah.
As if like studying philosophy somehow makes you bad at math or something.
Right.
I don't know.
It's this idea that they're completely opposed.
Right.
But Mahfud takes it a step further. He asks, why do we see these fields as being opposite in the first place?
Yeah.
And he points out that this push for purely practical education often comes from, and I'm quoting here, successful businessmen
Okay.
who benefit from a workforce that doesn't question authority.
It sounds like what we're talking about is like a deliberate strategy. It's not just like random complaints about too many liberal arts majors or whatever.
Exactly. It's very deliberate. And that's where I think this comparison to slavery that Mahfud makes is really unsettling.
Yeah.
He argues that this focus on, useful skills to the exclusion of critical thinking or broader context, that it produces a workforce that is easily controlled.
But isn't there some level of specialization necessary in today's world? We can't all be like Renaissance polymaths or something.
That's a good point. And Mahfud does acknowledge the specialization has its place,
Right.
but he's warning against a system that prioritizes economic function over individual development.
Okay.
It's the difference between training someone for a specific job versus educating them to be like a free-thinking citizen.
So where do we see this playing out today? Like, what are some concrete examples?
Well, Mahfud points to a few trends, particularly in the U.S. and Latin America.
Okay.
The push for charter schools, for example,
Uh-huh.
often comes at the expense of public education.
Right.
And there's this growing demonization of public universities,
Yeah.
especially those with strong humanities programs.
And it seems like a lot of politicians are very quick to label anything that they dislike as socialist. And it seems like universities are a prime target for that.
Exactly. And Mahfud argues that these attacks on public education are being driven by what he calls utilitarian ideology,
Yeah.
which sees education solely as a means to an economic end.
Uh-huh.
And he sees echoes of this in the rise of libertarian capitalists
Okay.
who tend to blame societal problems on what they call socialist ideas
Right.
that are coming from universities.
So it's like, let's double down on the useful skills, even if it means, sacrificing critical thinking and broader knowledge.
Yeah, it's the gist of it. And
Yeah.
so they advocate for this return to a very narrow vocational education system,
Okay.
one that produces obedient workers rather than informed citizens.
Which, again, kind of goes back to that point about slavery.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And to kind of drive this point home, he tells this story about Juan Manzano, who was a slave in 19th century Cuba.
Wow.
And Manzano was brutally tortured for daring to write his memoirs,
Oh, my gosh.
which is a powerful example of what can happen when knowledge is deemed useless by those in power.
Yeah, that's heartbreaking.
Uh,
But it's also a really powerful reminder that you can't just extinguish the thirst for knowledge that easily.
and it highlights the danger of letting this purely utilitarian view of education take hold.
Right.
Because once you start defining certain types of knowledge as useless, you open the door for censorship and oppression.
So what does Mahfud suggest that we do about this? It feels like, we're up against some pretty powerful forces here.
He doesn't offer any easy solutions,
Right.
but he does urge us to recognize these historical patterns
Uh-huh.
and to resist this push towards a purely utilitarian education system.
But what does that resistance look like? Is it about like individual choices, or do we need some kind of systemic change? What is he talking about there?
Well, he argues that it's both.
Awesome.
So on an individual level, it's about recognizing the value of all knowledge, even if it doesn't have an immediate economic payoff.
Right.
It's about supporting teachers and institutions that prioritize critical thinking over rote memorization.
Yeah, I can see that. And I imagine it also means being willing to kind of push back against those who just dismiss certain fields of study as useless.
Absolutely. We need to be having these uncomfortable conversations about, whose interests are being served by the current system,
Yeah.
who benefits when you have a workforce that's trained to follow orders rather than to think for themselves.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if we've just completely lost sight of like what education is truly for.
And that's a question that Mahfud wants us all to really grapple with.
Right.
If education is truly about liberation like his grandfather believed, then we need to reclaim it from those who seek to control and limit its potential.
So where do we go from here? Like, what are some concrete steps that we can take to actually shift the tide? It can feel really overwhelming, Like, how do you even begin to push back against these huge systemic forces?
Yeah, it's true. There's no easy answer or magic bullet or anything like that. But Mahfud reminds us that even small acts of resistance can make a difference.
Okay.
He uses that example of his father, trading his labor for books that he might never even read. It was a statement about the inherent value of knowledge regardless of its immediate utility.
So maybe it starts with how we talk about education.
Yeah.
How we value different kinds of knowledge, even in our own homes and communities.
Absolutely. Are we encouraging kids to explore their passions, even if those passions don't lead to a high-paying job?
Right.
Are we supporting teachers who foster critical thinking and creativity?
Yeah, and what about on like a bigger scale? Are there specific things that listeners can do to support this more holistic vision of education?
Well, there are definitely avenues for action. Mahfud highlights the importance of supporting public education,
Okay.
which is often the first target of those who are pushing for this purely utilitarian model.
Makes sense.
So getting involved in local school boards, advocating for increased funding, these are all ways to make a difference.
And what about universities? They seem to be under attack from so many different angles right now.
Yeah, supporting public universities is absolutely crucial.
Okay.
They're often the last bastion of a more expansive view of education,
Wow.
one that values the humanities and the social sciences alongside the STEM fields.
Well, yeah.
So donating to these institutions, attending their public lectures, speaking out against political attacks, these are all forms of resistance.
It sounds like Mahfud is calling for kind of cultural shift, a reevaluation of what we prioritize as a society.
He is. He's challenging us to move beyond this narrow focus on economic output
Uh-huh.
and to rediscover the true purpose of education,
I'm with that.
to foster critical thinking, to cultivate informed citizens, to empower individuals to shape their own destinies.
Because ultimately that's what liberation is all about, right? The ability to think for yourself, to question the status quo, to imagine a better future.
Exactly. And Mahfoud's article is a powerful reminder that the fight for that kind of liberation, it starts with education.
Well, that about wraps up this deep dive into the ideas of Professor Mahfud. But before we go, I want to leave our listeners with one final question. If education is truly about liberation, what will you do to reclaim its power both for yourself and for future generations? Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.